Welcome to History Comes Alive, the podcast that takes you on a deep dive into a new historical topic every episode. Join us as we explore the nuances of historical events you probably didn't learn about in school. Here's your host, Jeff Nichols.
Welcome back. This is going to be an intense episode. It's different than what I thought it would be. The contrast to our day and time was striking, at least the focus and perceived outcomes. To me, if you want to understand a people, a distinct culture, a good place to start, well, good places, is to begin to understand their religion, what's considered sacred, their society, its organization, and its economic system, or the principles that drive their political economics. We've done a pretty good job of developing their religious zeal and dedication. In that, we also developed some aspects of their societal organization. We spent considerably less time talking about their political economics. So in this episode, we will develop their social structure from a slightly different angle, education. And afterward, we will begin to lay the groundwork of how their economy was built from a philosophical aspect. We won't answer all the questions or solve all of the riddles, but we'll come away ready to work through the significance, the uniqueness of their situation. Now, I've got to warn you, this episode is one part organized outline and one part off the cuff, personal commentary exceeding most of the episodes. I think this is an important topic. It strikes a chord with me, but it also could be one that seems boring, that could be presented in a boring manner, and I hope that I don't do that. So anyway, as we move forward chronologically, we'll see what the net effect of these philosophies had when they were implemented, when they were put into practice. I mean, there's the possible, right? The theory of something, and then there's the actual, that's put into effect. Recently, I recorded an episode with Travis Masterbone. He hosts the podcast, The Unveiled Patriot. Feel free to check it out on YouTube. It was a 3-hour conversation that covered a ton of ground, and it was mostly unplanned. So anyway, we spent some time talking about Aristotle, his views and his thought process. And it was kind of choppy because of the off-the-cuff nature. I mean, that's not always a recommended approach for subjects like that, but I think it came out okay. But one thing I didn't bring up, which I almost always do when talking about the procession from Socrates to Plato to Aristotle, is the fact that in Aristotle, we get not only the philosophical positions, but history also captured many of those ideas in action. And so, oddly enough, that conversation, which again was relatively unplanned, ties in nicely with a lot of the subject matter in a roundabout way that we're going to cover today. And that's where that kind of ad-libbing comes in. I'm going to be weaving in and out of the chronological subject matter of Puritan education with some of the larger ideas and conversations that we can have around it, going back to Aristotle and then all the way to our current contemporary time. So at any rate, the procession went from Socrates, who taught Plato, who taught Aristotle. There were some pretty intense disagreements between Plato and Aristotle that caused division. We won't go into those today. But Aristotle left Plato and began his own school, the Lyceum. Anyway, Aristotle was called to be the tutor of King Philip of Macedon's son. And one of the drivers of the Greeks was order, the way things are. There was a desire to understand the world, understand its organization. So Aristotle's greatest student was Philip's son. And he put those philosophies, those concepts to practice and attempted to bring order to the known world. He wanted to organize and understand the world around him. Legend has it that he oversaw the greatest scientific endeavor, the most expensive scientific endeavor known to mankind until NASA put a man on the moon. I don't know if that's true or not, but I've read that multiple times over the years. So it's a huge scientific endeavor. He collected samples of plants and animals and drawings of landscapes and fauna from all over the world as he traveled. And these samples would often make their way back to Lyceum for further study and analysis. Now, this prince would become great, and I mean really great. Philip's son was Alexander the Great. And so while he was busy conquering most of the known world of his day, he was constantly collecting and documenting and cataloging animals, plants, landscapes, fauna, you name it, while he was conquering the world. So you see, he implemented the philosophies, the concepts, or the ideas that he had learned from Aristotle. He put them into practice. Ideas and actions, convictions have consequences. Reality exists whether you believe it or not. The outcome of most actions is rational, it's perceivable and measurable. That is to say, there is truth in the physical world. Gravity, entropy, the physical laws of nature, which we all presume upon every day. I mean, things hold steady, right? I never go to bed at night worrying if the floor is going to give out underneath my feet when I get up in the morning. I just know it's going to keep its composition. I take that for granted because I trust the laws of nature that I've experienced. That's the physical world. But you could say the same thing and raise the same types of arguments in the metaphysical world, those things that we don't see and touch and perceive. You see, just like in the physical world, in the metaphysical world, ideas and actions, convictions have consequences. Reality exists whether you believe it or not. The outcome of most actions is rational, it's perceivable and measurable. That is to say that there is truth in the physical world. Gravity, entropy, the physical laws of nature, which we all presume upon every day. Philosophies and ideas can be put to practice. You can turn the metaphysical into the physical world, right? You can live it out. They can be measured for desired effect. Their merit can be proved. Applying the lessons of Aristotle, Alexander made uniform a large part of the known ancient world. Now, I do realize that can be a controversial time for some, but not generally in the West. But you do realize with all the unifying, there was strong central power to enforce this. So great progress in Hellenizing the world through science and the sword. Anyway, there are universal truths that, once applied, do produce predictable outcomes. Even if we do not know or understand exactly how, our lives are governed by these truths. One way we can understand truth or define it is when our mind agrees with what we sense, with what we see or hear or experience. By these methodologies, we learn to manipulate the world that we live in. We advance. If we deny what's obvious, our mind denies the reality around us, and we are in disagreement with the truth. We're not true. We have falsehood, lies. One problem that we as humans have is that we oftentimes distort what we see, what we experience. We bend the facts, we twist and manipulate to suit our predigested narrative. We also may fall into error if we're not willing or capable to compare our small, personal, experiential sample with the larger world around us. That's called context. So making a statement, no matter how emphatic or popular, doesn't make a statement true. I'll give you a real-life example that I lived through. There once was a guy at work that was a pretty smart guy. He also had a pretty bad attitude at times. He was quite proud of his developed intellect, as he would tell you. But he also was a little too full of himself. He started to talk about philosophical things one day, and there was a large group of people around. We clashed a lot of times. We didn't always agree on things. But he started talking about the fact that if he didn't see something, then it didn't exist, that it didn't have to be true. And I started asking him to explain that. And he started out talking about the metaphysical world that we live in. But then he quickly turned that to the physical, that if something wasn't seen, if it wasn't perceived that way, then it wasn't true. It was part of our imagination. So, everybody had kind of started gathering around because I was poking and prodding with questions, and he was getting irritated with me and raising his voice. And so when I finally got him to expound what he really wanted to say was that if you don't see it, it's not true, because he was defending some other issue that he hadn't personally experienced. He was dismissing, my argument. So I said, we can make this really simple then. Close your eyes, and I'm going to knee you in the balls, and I'm going to knee you in the balls hard. Now, because you don't see it, and you don't believe that I'm going to do it, and you don't perceive that you're going to feel pain, you should be okay. Well, needless to say, he never took me up on that. Because the reality is, no matter how emphatically he wanted to argue, no matter what combination of words, nouns, verbs, adverbs, adjectives he strung together to make his sentence sound very philosophical and high and mighty, the reality is he wasn't willing to put that philosophy to practice. Because rationally speaking, common sense told you that he was wrong. Oftentimes, we can do that with a host of things that we don't actually experience ourselves. We can rationally measure what somebody is saying the outcome will be or should be against predictably what it will be. So where am I going with this? What point am I trying to make? I'm actually setting us up to recognize that even though we work through a system that no longer exists, a system that may be unpalatable to many of our modern contemporary senses, we got to be careful not to dismiss it entirely because there may be some relevance for us to learn and to apply from. So going back to the concept of what is truth or what is not truth, people tend to be more stable the more they're in agreement with reality. Vices drive us from reality. They promise rewards that reality has demonstrated time and again, generally, do not materialize. Societies exist in that same position. And so with that, to advance, you have to embrace reality. You can deny for a while, but eventually it will all unravel. There is natural law in play, both physically and metaphysically. Or you can embrace it, you can enforce it, and move society forward. If the society is closed or surrounded, or has certain boundaries, as well as strong leadership, by boundaries I mean geographically, as well as strong leadership, it stands a good chance at excelling past their contemporaries at whatever endeavor it pursues. Puritan New England was a closed society, bounded by New Netherland and New Sweden and Arcadia, New France, the dissidents of Rhode Island, and a little later, the Quakers of Pennsylvania, the ocean. In other words, their society was contained, it was controlled. It took decades for dilution to set in. And by then, the economy was in the driver's seat, and it drove fast. They had to drive. They had ambitions to excel. They took the measures necessary to achieve success. They diligently strove to understand the world around them, the world in which they lived. They appreciated the classics in philosophy and language and reason. They applied those skills. They also saw the necessity to pass these skills, this collective knowledge, not just from their experiences, but from history, onto their progeny, to extend their success and good fortune for another generation. So as a society, they realized the importance and practiced the discipline of learning. So a fundamental aspect of their societal structure was education. And I want to draw a model of what that looked like, a working model that we can carry with us in our minds as we cover their society and culture over the next several months. It will go a long way toward understanding what they did. It will help build a memorable model that each of us can use to make better decisions in the days in which we live. And I so desperately want to understand the world that I live in and make better decisions for myself. I mean, don't you? I mean, isn't that why you listen to podcasts or read books? So it is when we talk about the success of the Puritans in contrast to other groups of any time and place in history. It's formidable. Education, equitable trading partners and partnerships, natural resources, and the unified embrace of the concept of excellence. Education played a pivotal role here. Now, I am indebted to Thomas Jefferson Wertenbaker for illustrating what their model looked like. A good chunk of the outline originally came from his book, The Puritan Oligarchy. But probably more so, the commentary from this particular episode comes from my own mind and my own life experiences and examples that I remembered as I read through what Thomas Jefferson Wertenbaker was illustrating for me, if that makes sense. Because that model still has impact today, or at least until recently. Its more secular cousin was envisioned and implemented 200 years later by Horace Mann. But that's a story for another day. Anyway, the point is, pay attention to the Puritan model and then compare it to what we settle for today, what we tolerate. And putting aside all our petty pet projects, the results that we are reaping. I mean, fundamentally, as a society, if we're looking to not just survive but succeed, the question that should be asked is, what do we expect from public education? For most of us, the answer lies somewhere in the conversation and neighborhood of reading, writing, and arithmetic. And if it is, are we realizing the intended outcome? And if not, why? If our culture becomes a culture of illiterates or ignoramuses, we will fall. If we lose the ability or even the desire to achieve excellence, we won't. It goes back to that conversation about ideas having consequences. What kind of public education are we supporting? Are we supportive or tolerant? I mean, do we like what we're getting or do we just settle for it? Is it successful by the benchmarks necessary to compete on a global stage? Is it successful by the benchmarks that allow our young people the advantages of literacy, of basic skills in mathematics and critical thinking? Do we prepare our young to achieve, or do we prepare them to settle for mediocrity at best? Are we successful or not? In the real world, where competition is real, there are societies that strive to educate their young. Those societies most engaged in the successful transfer of knowledge to the next generation will, more than likely, experience the most success in the years to come. So let's look at a successful model. The goal of Puritan education was to protect their descendants from error, religiously and scholarly. The initial leaders were trained ministers, and that meant in those days, college educated. The very purpose of education was often associated with ministry. William Hubbard, a prominent man that we've quoted before on civil matters, put it this way, quote, "What advantage the Reformed churches have had by their princes and states erecting schools of learning in their several domains is so well known that there needs no more be said about this argument," end quote. And it was true. The Europeans, the rising Protestant municipalities and nations, were enjoying a great reputation for education. They were excelling. The Dutch had retooled their schools to agree with the Dutch Reformed Church. The Scots were beholden to the Presbyterian General Assembly. The Huguenots, in leaving the education of the Roman Church, established schools of their own. And so, too, New England would educate their children as they saw fit. They wanted to succeed, but also feared that a poor educational system or a poor approach would prevent immigration of like-minded Puritans from England. They needed to compete with the best schools in Europe, and so they would. So for them, the marriage of religious, civil, and educational priorities was common sense. I mean, most all of the European world was in agreement on this. So they looked at the world around them and they said, what's the best, fastest, quickest, most efficient way to train our children, our young folks, the next generation up so that they're actually literate and thinking salient creatures? They didn't get bogged down in all of the siloed, side arguments and pet projects that some small minority of the population wanted out of their own desires and emotional needs, right? They wanted to succeed, and so a general education, giving their general population a general understanding of the world that they lived in, a common worldview, was important. So education was competitive. It was important to be able to demonstrate successful outcomes. All these groups and entire nations wanted to succeed. Their goals were achievement. I mean, do you ever get the feeling our contemporary educational and civil leaders, we have a secular public system, but did you ever stop to think that they may not be setting their sights on scholastic achievement? Before you answer that, consider the state of public education in America. I mean, you mean to tell me, I'm supposed to believe that the outcomes we're seeing are the best we can do? From a national, regional, state, county, local grassroots perspective, are we getting the results that we expect, the results that we need as a society? Putting aside the electronics, the computer games, and the social media aspect of Facebook or Instagram or Snapchat or whatever other one you're doing right now, how equipped are our kids to actually compete in the larger world? In fact, all the nations represented in European colonialism felt the same way as the Puritans. They felt the same urgency. Again, the Swedes of Delaware had Lutheran schools, and New Amsterdam had Dutch Reformed schools. They actually founded Rutgers College. In the South, other Englishmen, the Anglicans, they founded William and Mary. The Baptists founded Brown, and Princeton was Presbyterian. Thomas Jefferson, 150 years later, suggested that public schools be under no specific denomination. Hence, Horace Mann, just a few decades after Jefferson, made that vision a reality. But the standards remained high. They remained almost a holy endeavor. Teachers were to be public role models. They were to be educated in the classics, reason, philosophy, the languages, history. Much was expected of the students as well. Their goal was social engineering. All public education is to a point. But that engineering was all about producing the finest, most learned population. That social engineering was all about teaching and graduating young people with skills and knowledge and energy to produce, to succeed, not to settle. The entire system scrutinized the investment of education. If it didn't work, they moved away from the failure and toward success. And again, how is this current generation doing? How are we molding young minds and encouraging? Are we placing high expectations on our young, instilling a desire to compete and move society forward? Are we developing a generation that will avoid error, that will work together for the common good, that will one day take up the mantle and ensure that their children will inherit a competent system that will prepare them for the rigors of life with not only literacy and basic skills in math and the sciences, but discipline and a treasure trove of wisdom gained from history, recognizing the successful societies and those that failed. Maybe they don't graduate with a belly full of life experiences, but they have had their brains poured into like a reservoir, illustrations and examples from the past. They may have dragged their feet, the Puritans, on evangelism, but not on education. Thomas Jefferson Wertenbaker put it this way, and I'm going to start kind of in the middle. This is just a quick paragraph. I'm going to start kind of in the middle of the storyline, but by the end of this paragraph, you'll understand exactly what I'm saying here. He says, quote, several years after the Arabella nosed into Boston Harbor to herald the coming of the Puritan host, the General Court appropriated 400 pounds towards a school or college. The project hung fire for some months while the ministers and magistrates battled furiously to cast out the Hutchinson heresy and the intractable Anne with it. But in 1636, a board of overseers was appointed, a house purchased in Cambridge, and a professor engaged. The next year, when John Harvard died, leaving his library and half of his estate to the infant institution, it was named Harvard College. End quote. So here we see the birth of Harvard at Cambridge. After they established their planned communities, the schools were next. New England was soon turning out not just trained ministers, but physicians and surgeons, fine men, capable men, recognized men, men who would travel the world in the execution of their vocations. Such a small population turning out such notable men on a global scale. That's impressive. Their most important graduates would be clergy and grammar school teachers. That's right, clergy and grammar school teachers. The most important thing was to be self-sufficient in the education of their children. Speaking in the nomenclature of his day, once again, William Hubbard wrote, the importance to the churches of educational independence was emphasized by William Hubbard. He said, quote, it is not meet that the Israelites should always go down to the Philistines to sharpen their weapons, which they are to use in fighting against the enemies of God's church, or, for whetting their tools, they must use in tilling God's field. Julian complains that the Christians beat the heathen philosophers with their own weapons. Therefore did he subtly contrive to deprive the Christians of the benefit of schools and other means of humane learning, thinking that to be the likeliest means whereby to overthrow the Christian religion. So in other words, Hubbard says if we want to succeed in the world, we've got to succeed by educating our own, because the world's not going to help us. And then we read again, Hubbard's words were echoed by Increase Mather in a sermon preached in 1677. The colony must nourish the schools and the college, he pointed out, quote, that so there might be able instruments raised up for the propagating of truth in succeeding generations, end quote. The General Court also placed itself on record in this matter by declaring, quote, skill in the tongues and liberal arts, end quote, not only laudable but necessary for the being of the Commonwealth and the churches, end quote. So two quick things in that. What we see there is that the Puritans, the leaders, the magistrates, the clergy even were recognizing not just the importance of education, but they were also recognizing the importance of the educational system being slightly separated from the churches. So again, these guys are speaking from their time in history. Hubbard's views would have been shared by most. Even those from competing or opposing camps would have viewed what he said as right and true. The philosophical approach would be the same. So I'm not advocating for the churches to control the public schools. In a lot of ways, neither were they. But the absolute disconnect from the cultural values of Judeo-Christian philosophy, the almost fear of it, is not rational either in our society. we are still, by any measurable means, a society that's greatly influenced by the historic Christian faith. Like all other collective experiences, it will manifest itself naturally in the public sector. The opposing position could ask what happens when the opiate of the masses is taken away, dramatically, or ridiculed by state. How'd that work last century? How'd that work for Mao or Hitler or Stalin? I guess, how did that work for the people under them? For the Chinese or the Germans or the Russians? Where's the utopia that forms with the death of religion? Answer me that. Neither Jefferson nor Horace Mann would have advocated that. Years ago, I presented a series of lectures. Well, it was 3 years of history lessons to a small group of middle and high school age students that were preparing for college. It was actually in addition to their regular schoolwork. I spent some time with that group covering Horace Mann. And I thought about it, as I'm putting this episode together, maybe I should do a short episode, like a bonus episode, just on Horace Mann for this audience. He was a foundational figure in the development of public education almost 200 years ago. It's a very successful system that he's designed, as long as you're counting success by literacy, character, and personal achievement. The traits that actually move a nation forward. Secular, yes. Twisting itself into a pretzel to avoid the philosophical underpinnings of the larger surrounding society, no. And I think I can defend that position pretty well. I mean, it seems like everyone can justify their position by quoting a guy like Thomas Jefferson, let's say. But he must be measured by what he said in context and what he did and advocated when the time came, in his time and not ours. So I want to tell a story about Thomas Jefferson here that doesn't quite hit on the educational vein, but it definitely runs parallel to our discussion today and maybe opens some of that up a little bit. So Jefferson's an interesting guy because I wouldn't say he was a Christian per se. He was a theist, but he wasn't anti-religion. And he also existed during that small window of time, 20 years or so, in the late 1700s, at the birth of our nation, when the philosophy of the Enlightenment was not at war with religion. Now, I didn't create that scenario. I think I read that from Paul Johnson, 20 years ago. But at any rate, I'm not the originator of that thought. I do happen to agree with it and endorse it, but I wanted to throw that out there. So at the birth of the United States of America, at the conception of the current Constitution that we have, the Founding Fathers, children of the Enlightenment, they weren't yet at war with the concept of religion. Now, just a few years later in the French Revolution, for example, the tide had turned and philosophy was now at war with religion in a lot of ways. And so the secular threw the baby out with the bathwater. And we all see what happened with that. So at any rate, Jefferson did start the University of Virginia as a secular college. In the opening decades of the 19th century, I think it was like 1819, he started the University of Virginia as a secular college in response to the denominational colleges, I believe. But that's not an indicator of his larger positions on religion and its place in society. I mean, again, it seems like everyone can justify their position by quoting a guy like Thomas Jefferson. But he must be measured by what he said in context and what he did and advocated when the time came, in his time and not ours. I mean, we're all controversial at times. We're all hypocritical at times. We all flip-flop and change course sometimes. So what? That very well may be an example of a life being lived, a life that recognizes incongruencies without an actual lever to change those at the present time. Someone learning and evolving, working through the controversies of their day intelligently, thoughtfully, rationally. A wise king once asked of his subjects, quote, "Wisdom gives strength to the wise more than 10 rulers who are in a city. Surely there is not a righteous man on earth who does good and never sins. Do not take to heart all the things that people say, lest you hear your servant cursing you. Your heart knows that many times you yourself have cursed others." End quote. Here's the translation. Stop being so petty and thick-skinned. Stop granting yourself allowances for preference and criticism you're not willing to afford others. I mean, my take is, who knows? Maybe the opposition is right. So many things that I've learned, so many advances in my own life have come from when people have actually challenged my position. So anyway, there's a parallel argument that we can examine from Thomas Jefferson to see what his attitude was in practice. the difference between his personal views or convictions and what he understood the spirit of the Constitution actually was, the makeup of our government. So as the story goes, well, first, there's one unique thing about Thomas Jefferson was that he personally answered letters from citizens when he was the president. He answered those letters directly. They came in, he read the letter, he wrote a response. Imagine doing that today. Obviously, we've got a lot more people writing letters today, but that was a huge undertaking. So at any rate, there arose a controversy in New England, the very region that we're developing in our series, around the turn of the 18th to the 19th century, around the time that Jefferson assumed the presidency. In 1801, he received a letter from the Baptist Convention of Danbury, Connecticut. So a bunch of Baptist guys living in Connecticut. We realize that it wasn't that much earlier in the history of the colonies that the Baptists weren't very popular. They were still a minority. And it seems that as the minority population, there were local ordinances being passed and enforced by the Congregationalists, the Reformed folks, that they felt, the Baptists, they felt that their rights were being violated as they were forced to comply with the majority. Things like the restrictive commerce laws known as blue laws that restricted shopping and entertainment activities on the Sabbath. Those just weren't in effect in New England. They were in effect a lot of times in Europe as well. I mean, John Calvin himself even fell victim to this. He wasn't a Sabbatarian in that sense. But one day after John Calvin had preached, so the story goes, he was visited by his own church police when he was lawn bowling. And they basically told him that he was sinning because he was lawn bowling. And to be pleasant about this, he told them to bug off. He had done his service to God and now he was enjoying himself. So here is one source's overview of the letter from the Baptist Convention and Thomas Jefferson's response. It says, quote, "The origin of the expression separation of church and state is found in a letter from Thomas Jefferson written to the Danbury Baptist Association in 1802. As a side note, he had received the letter in 1801. He actually wrote the response in 1802. Okay, continuing on. The Danbury Baptist Association had written a letter to the president voicing their concern that their state constitution lacked specific protections of religious freedom. The Danbury Baptists wrote in the letter, quote, "What religious privileges we enjoy as a minor part of the state, we enjoy as favors granted, and not as inalienable rights. And these favors we receive at the expense of such degrading acknowledgments as are inconsistent with the rights of free men." End quote. Jefferson responded to the Danbury Baptists by referencing the Establishment Clause and Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment. He wrote, quote, "I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act of the whole American people which declared that their legislature should make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state," Jefferson said. The metaphor of a wall of separation was not intended to say that religion should not influence opinion on government issues. Rather, it was used to affirm free religious practice for citizens. End quote. In other words, regardless of personal sentiment or opinion, the original phrase, separation of church and state, was not in the founding documents. I said that one time to some family members, and I actually had a member of my family read the Constitution and the Bill of Rights 6 times through, beginning to end, determined to prove to me that I was wrong. The separation of church and state aren't in the founding documents. And furthermore, its context was not to suppress religion in the private or the government sector, but rather to preserve it. As far as institutions go, like public education, the government is not supposed to endorse one denomination or religion over another. That does not mean there can be no representation. And so as you can see, this is something that we need to work out in our society all over again. And it's something that is near and dear to my heart, not just the concept of, what's the place of religion in secular society, but how do we work through any of these issues? How do we put aside our personal knee-jerk opinions or emotional responses and work through legally the system that we have, what it permits and what it doesn't? Because every time we cut somebody off at the knees, to preserve our own pet peeve or to advance our own cause, you've got to remember you're opening up license for someone else to cut you off at the knees on their pet peeve or their license, correct? So when we talk about the separation of church and state, and we'll get back to the Puritans and their educational system, when we bring this around, you'll see this actually makes sense. I mean, there's a point that I'm trying to make. But getting back to the separation of church and state, people sound very foolish. I'll be honest, in my opinion, downright stupid, oftentimes, when they argue for the removal of all religious symbolism from the public sector based on this argument. Local areas have a slightly different impression and expression based on heritage. I mean, if you're German or Irish or Italian, whatever, those slightly different impressions and expressions will quite expectedly be present in decision-making and in the formation of local policy and ordinances. Like in the case of the Danbury, Connecticut Baptists, their safety was protected, right? Their exercise of religion, but not necessarily their preferences. That would have been swinging their own argument 180 degrees. Thus, that is not a solution. They would have then been the minority directing the majority in what their personal preferences were. I mean, if you feel that way, use other arguments if you desire, but using the separation argument only leaves two conclusions. You're ignorant or you're intentionally deceptive in your argument. I mean, Jefferson was there, along with Madison and many others. I'm going to trust his interpretation, the original intent, over some Johnny or Jill come lately. If we're trying to preserve the spirit of the system we've inherited, they say a rising tide lifts all boats, right? So too, the fundamental philosophical system has managed to raise the standard of living from societal perspective above all others. That point can be argued, and that's fair, to hold it up for speculation. But the proof can still be witnessed in the physical world. The world comes in droves to our borders, more than any other state or nation. We might complain from within our society, inside the borders of the United States, but we're the idol of the world. That foundation was laid by the earliest generation of colonialism and codified by the founders, with all of its warts and shortcomings, many of which have been rectified and some are still being worked through. That's the difference between opinion and personal experience and a conclusion or a position rooted in reality with the greater context of the larger world around us. Comparing the current and local with the historical and global. Using our previous illustration then, the system that we're talking about is represented by Aristotle. The results are of Alexander. I'm not advocating for a parochialized public school system. I think there should be license for localized populations. There should be choice and options. Even among the parochial or ecclesiastical options, one should be careful. I mean, I was once friends with a guy who was awaiting the birth of his first child, as was I at the same time. So we were having coffee one day, and he thought that private Christian school was the only way to go. I mean, he had a friend, after all, that was a principal in a private school, and he had convinced my friend that that was the only way to go with education for your child. And I'm fine with that opinion, if you want to hold that. But then my friend started to challenge me a little about how I would educate my kids. He talked about all the bad stuff that he'd experienced in public school and heard about and the current state of public education. He was worried about how all of that may have adversely affected his own children. And I guess to a point, he was worrying for me about my children. I mean, I get it, and I appreciate that. I think most parents work through those things. But his approach struck me because he acted as though I either lacked the capacity to work through the concept or would be unable to draw the right conclusion myself. So I turned the conversation around on him. I asked him, what doctrines did his friend hold? What did he believe? What denomination was his school affiliated with? What was their doctrinal statement? Where were they on corporal punishment of the students? Were they Arminian or Calvinistic, covenantal or dispensational? I mean, he was shocked by those questions. I told him those considerations should weigh equally as heavy for any parent considering education for their child. I mean, frankly, you could have 3 kids, each with different educational needs, right? And so if you have the means to make choices, you could have one in public school and one in private school and one homeschooled. I mean, there are a lot of variables. But it seems that the place for public education in a society as vast as ours would be the least common denominator, Judeo-Christian philosophically oriented approach. That's right where our society is. Although that's speaking as if the system stays primarily the same. I'm most passionate about local and regional control. The regions of the nation vary. There can be standards in place with local ability to alter for local needs. If we have an open and vibrant society, and if we have people in authority that are actually interested in educating the kids, then the weaker local administrations would either be replaced or could look to other communities and see how they're organized. The thing with local control and invested leaders is that you can always compare what you're doing with your peers and adopt the system that achieves the greater outcome. Anyway, the Puritan model was a local and officially separate model from the church. But the church did control the whole of society, whether religious, civil, or educational, as they were the voters and elected officials. But technically, outside of the general laws, the schools were independent. Listen, I know that we can get uncomfortable talking about the intertwining of religion and education, but how do we solve problems in our society if we're not willing to talk about these things openly? We've all got religious persuasions, whether even if we're not religious, that's a religious persuasion, right? But what is the current state of public education in America today? What kinds of conversations should we be having then? What's the general temperature of society toward the system? How it's performing versus how it used to perform. You see, maybe some of the ideas the Puritans had were based on objective results. How are we doing? I imagine some distant time frame when another generation will look back to ours. What will our legacy be on education? The foundational learning must begin at home. So with that, 2 more quotes in rapid fire. These, again, are some of the concepts that the Puritans worried about, strived over, and what they talked about. The first one is, again, from our old friend William Hubbard. It says, quote, he gave an excellent illustration of the current point of view in the election sermon of 1676. He said, quote, it was well replied by an officer of the state to a nobleman that made small account of learning in the education of his son, aiming at no higher learning than to be able to ride a horse or fly a hawk, that if it were so, then noblemen's sons must be content that mean men's children should govern the kingdom. You get that? If you don't stress the idea of education with men that ought to know better, they'll be ruled by lesser men. And Uriah Oakes, I think he's a guy that we've quoted before. He sure comes up in a lot of the books that I read. But Uriah Oakes was another Puritan back then, and he was even more emphatic. Quote, the fall of schools and contempt of learning will make way for rudeness, ignorance, want of able instruments to manage church and state affairs, irreligion, and the ruin to this poor country. Think not that the commonwealth of learning may languish, and yet our civil and ecclesiastical state be maintained in good plight and condition. End quote. What did he say? If we get lax on education, then the entire system's going to fall apart. Don't deceive yourself. Poor education can only come to ruin. Let that sink in. Do you sense that we're living in a culture that places that kind of value on education, that sees the danger of failure? I know we live in a time where there's a lot of lip service, especially every election cycle. But what's the state of public education? What direction is it going? Is this just a perception thing, or is it really as bad as it seems? When is enough going to have been enough? I think you can receive the best education in America, especially if you have money. But what about the folks that don't? What happens to them? What type of lifestyle condemnation are we handing to generations of children that are receiving inferior public education? And again, from a national, state, regional, localized level, how is it that in so many communities across our country today, education is failing? And in so many of these areas, school administration after school administration and organization after organization fails year in and year out, decade after decade, to actually improve the academic achievement and output of those institutions. When is enough enough? So, at any rate, the Puritans arrived in New England with educated men, and then they had to replace them as they aged, and also had to prepare to accommodate those that would come. So the order of their activity makes perfect sense, but it does appear counterintuitive. They started with a college. Those trained men would create a successful elementary system. And in 1636, at the height of the Anne Hutchinson controversy, it was decided that a college must be established. They organized a board of overseers, purchased a house in Cambridge to be used as the college, and brought on a professor. The following year, John Harvard died. He left his library and a good sum of money to the college, aptly named Harvard. Although the first head of the college was a disaster, the second worked out smashingly. Henry Dunster of England's Cambridge organized the new college. He advanced its academic program and oversaw the construction of a new building. And the standards were high. As one contemporary put it, quote, when any scholar is able to understand Tully, or such like classical Latin author extempore, and make and speak Latin in verse and prose, and decline the paradigms of noun and verb in the Greek tongue, let him then be capable of admission, end quote. So, in case you're not familiar, Tully is actually a reference to Marcus Tullius Cicero, arguably ancient Rome's most famous orator, statesman, and lawyer. He lived in the days of Julius Caesar. Actually, he and Caesar were friends growing up, and he was there when Caesar was assassinated. Now, he was not a part of the conspiracy, but he did believe that that action saved the republic. He served as consul in 63 BC. Now, the consul was extremely important in Rome. That's a body of just two guys, highly distinguished in title. It was a position that replaced the king and enforced the Senate laws. So Cicero was not necessarily a contributor of new information or thought, but what he did do was translate the wisdom of the Greeks into Latin. We also have close to 1,000 of his personal letters, both private and official, which provides an overwhelming opportunity for voyeurism into the happenings firsthand, eyewitness accounts of decades of Roman history. Just a few quick points to develop the life of Cicero a little bit. He felt that the ideal government was an equal combination of monarchy, democracy, and aristocracy. The goal was to allow for royalty, the best of men, and the regular folks a shared role and responsibility. And one source that I read captured the essence of all of this by stating, quote, in 56, Cicero wrote two important books on government, known today as the Laws and the Republic. He wrote these books in the form of dialogue, discussions among friends, modeled after earlier works by the Greek philosopher Plato. Cicero wrote on papyrus scrolls and published his writings by using the common practice of having slaves copy them. In these two books, Cicero wanted to restore the Republic to its uncorrupted, truest form, which he believed had existed several generations earlier. He intended to persuade good and honorable men to participate actively in public affairs. Politics, he argued, was the most honorable of all professions. Boy, if he could only live in our day. His ideas were not new. He relied on Greek and Roman writings, many of which were later lost. In the Laws, Cicero explored his concept of natural law. He said, quote, law is the highest reason, implanted in nature, which commands what ought to be done and forbids the opposite, end quote. Thus, natural law is the guide for right and wrong in human affairs. Since reason, quote, is certainly common to us all, Cicero asserted, the law in nature is eternal and unchangeable, binding at all times upon all peoples. Cicero warned that it was never morally right for humans to make laws that violate natural law. Without laws, Cicero reasoned, there can be no state or government. More important, he continued, there must be equality under the law with no special exemptions. This is essentially said for justice, which in turn is necessary for a successfully functioning government. And then lastly, in the Republic, Cicero argued that laws are not enough for a just state. There must also be liberty. He said, but if liberty is not equally enjoyed by all the citizens, it's not liberty at all. Therefore, liberty cannot exist unless the people have the supreme power in government. End quote. Did you catch that? Cicero believed that monarchy, democracy, and aristocracy was the best way, that people of learned nature and people of power and prominence should share the workload with people of lesser stature. He believed that everybody should be treated equally under the law with no preference, or nobody actually was enjoying liberty. And again, look at the state of our republic today. But these are the standards by which the Puritans were beginning to build their society. So again, let's bring this back then to where we are. What we're focusing on in this episode, the Puritan educational system. Well, their ideas and philosophy. And let us also remember that understanding Tully or Cicero, which we just reviewed, there's a depth there, right? And others like him were competencies that only opened the door for possible admission to college. This understanding was not the end of education, but rather only the key that unlocked the door. You think these guys were well equipped for college? After admission, the students' curriculum consisted of grammar, logic, rhetoric, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, metaphysics, ethics, natural philosophy, Greek, Hebrew, and ancient history. Divinity students had significantly more rigorous studies. Man. The public support was regional. Money, but also because the hard currency was scarce, which again, we're going to talk about in the weeks to come. I think you're really going to like the episodes coming up on the economy of the Puritans. But at any rate, money, hard money, was scarce. And so they supported the idea of public education by donating wheat and wampum, malt, corn, apples, anything they could get their hands on, that they could contribute to the welfare and the well-being of the building of this educational system. To ensure future classes for the college, it was required that every town over 100 families had to have a grammar school in which the teacher could teach both in Latin and Greek. I mean, just so we're clear, he may not have taught consistently in these tongues. I mean, that's not what they were doing. But when he did, the students would have had to have had some familiarity, right? I mean, how is that for an educational system? So we can laugh and mock and dismiss if we want to. But this foundational approach to education is one of the pillars to their success. And make no mistake, this region would go on to excel at an alarming rate, as we'll see both by the industry of the people and the manipulation of the natural resources that they had at their disposal. I mean, when you think about this, does it ever feel like our generation has embraced wholesale the concept of mediocrity? We seem to celebrate the idea of education without actually embracing it, instilling its virtues in our youth. And don't misunderstand, my strongest indictment is reserved for myself. I laid waste a long time ago of my own educational opportunities, and I've long since rued the day. I was a jail counselor for about 10 years. It was not an act of contrition or penance, don't get me wrong. But the depth of that privilege, its solemn experience that it offered to me, did not escape me. I took it as an opportunity to help another human being to make better choices. And often those choices were made possible through encouraging these guys to learn about the world in which we all live and apply those lessons to their own lives. Anyways, I digress. These schools, as I have said, were separate from the church. But realistically, all of Puritan society was controlled by the church, sometimes to obscene levels of abuse, as we've discovered in our time together. Also, as we can see through the lens of men such as Nathaniel Hawthorne. But again, we have to judge these guys in the context of the world they lived in. They were like most of their contemporaries, just better at it, more driven, more successful. But they had boundaries, geographically, as we talked about, but also politically. I mean, they were subjects of the king, right? It's what they accomplished within those boundaries that must be taken into consideration, and frankly, on many levels, most admired, envied for anyone who wants their society to thrive. So moving down the food chain then of education, if the feeders for college were the grammar schools, who was to feed the grammar schools? The answer to that is primary schools. So by 1642, Massachusetts Bay required households to teach their children and apprentices to read perfectly. In 1645, this idea was further enlarged by requiring the towns of 50 families or more to provide public education so that all the kids would learn to read and write. This was a tough consideration. Think about it. Even the farmers, as the population density began to expand out into the wilderness at that point, living out of the populated areas, were required to teach their children. I mean, this was an added burden to farming, right? But to fail to properly teach your children to read and write could be subject to fines for both the father and the town in which he lived. So you've got magistrates making sure you're teaching your kid to read and write. This system was unequivocally the best the colonies had to offer. The teacher's role in Puritan society was powerful. It came with expectations of high moral character and sound judgment. They were role models. There were laws that subjected them to moral, scandal-free lives. I mean, do I believe in social redemption? Yes. Do I believe that adults with consistent issues and train wrecks of personal lives, habitual and chronic, should be in positions of authority? No. And by the way, just so that we're clear, having different political or religious views than myself does not constitute scandal in my eyes. I'm confident enough in my own views, or confident enough in my own intellect and my own ability to perceive an argument and to understand it, that when I have a disagreement with someone over these things, that we can work through that. Sometimes we just have to agree that we're not going to agree. I don't like the term agree to disagree, because if I think you're wrong, flat out wrong, then I'm not going to agree that it's okay. But I am okay if we have differences of opinion. So the concept here isn't that they've got to think just like I do or it's scandalous. The idea is that there are certain societal norms, and it is okay to have certain societal norms, and societal norms may change over time. But the reality is, to have somebody placed in charge of children that are significantly out of whack with what societal norms are doesn't seem wise or prudent to me. Just my opinion. At any rate, in time, just a few decades later, some of this rigidity would be relaxed. There's a whole traceable storyline to that we're not going to develop here. But the relaxing in no way ill-affected the educational quality or the emphasis that the Puritans placed. Rather, it had more to do with ecclesiastical doctrine. And by that time, however, the economy was developing quite nicely, rapidly, and the Puritan state, the oligarchy, would grow rich and prosperous and influential, creating its own identity within the colonial structure and within the growing English empire. So as I said in the beginning of the podcast, to me, if you want to understand a people, a distinct culture, a good place to start, good places to start or to begin to understand is their religion. I mean, what's considered sacred, their society, its organization, and its economic system, or the principles that drive their political economics. I think that we've covered sufficiently enough their religious zeal and how their society developed by considering that one great aspect, education. The subtle references to these systems, aspects of their unique culture, moving forward will make a lot more sense for us. And now I think is a good time to develop their economic structure, their economic model, their resources, and their trade partners. They were not capitalists. Like so many aspects of their culture, their views on economics were very different than many of ours. We have to understand how these parts of their economy developed. All of Europe was in economic transition. Where did New England fit into this larger landscape? Isn't this really, frankly, this question, where did New England fit into this larger economic landscape? Isn't that what we've all been waiting for in this podcast series? It is. That's how we understand history, isn't it? But those are all stories for another day. And until then, I hope our time together this day has really helped the history to come alive.
Thanks for listening to History Comes Alive. We hope today's episode has given you valuable new information and inspired you to dive even deeper. Don't forget to check out Jeff's website, historywithjeff.com, and engage with Jeff across all your favorite social media platforms at History with Jeff. Join us next time as more history comes alive.